Thank you for coming to this program on this beautiful day with Professor Flamm. We are recording this program on YouTube, so you can watch it later, you can share it with your friends. And then I just wanted to mention a few programs we have coming up. Tomorrow, local author Marty Ross Dolan will be here in conversation with Lee Martin at 7 o'clock. This is for the launch of her memoir, Always There, Always Gone, a mother-daughter story of multi-generational trauma, grief, discovery, and love. And then we have another history program on May 19th at 6:30 to remember the life, activism, and legacy of Malcolm X on what would have been his 100th birthday. And this is a conversation with OSU professor Justin Jeffries and WCBE Jazz Sunday host Jack Marchbanks. So please join us for that too. And now I have a few words about Dr. Flamm. Professor Michael Flamm received the Welch Award for Scholarly Achievement and the Welch Meritorious Teaching Award at Ohio Wesleyan University, where he taught for 25 years. The author or co-author of 5 books and an audiobook, he served as a Fulbright Scholar and a faculty consultant to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the College Board, and the National Academy of Sciences. He was also an elected member of the Executive Board of the Organization of American Historians, the largest professional association dedicated to the teaching and study of U.S. history. And he currently teaches at The Ohio State University. So please welcome Dr. Flamm.
Well, let me say, first of all, happy Mother's Day, and thank you all for giving up part of this beautiful afternoon to come in here and listen to me. I appreciate it. Also, I want to thank you for supporting the Bexley Library. I think, as many of you know, public libraries are under assault from many directions right now. So, you know, the more we can support them in every way possible, I think that is wonderful. Today, I am going to give you a brief, I promise we'll be done by 4. You'll be back out to celebrate the rest of the sort of an overview and a preview of a biography I'm writing about a remarkable Jewish woman from Minnesota. And I think out of necessity, I'm going to fly at about 30,000 feet and talk about some of her accomplishments. If you have a question, feel free to ask me afterwards. I can go into much greater depth and detail about various different aspects of her life. But just so you know, she lived to be 100, so she had a lot of time to accomplish many, many things. So that's why I'm going to move rather quickly. And I will tell you that this is sort of the first time I've ever given a talk before I've finished or even substantially finished the project. So in some ways, I'm going to try out some themes and ideas with you. And if you really like it or you really hate it, again, you can let me know and I'll make changes accordingly as I go through this. First of all, though, I want to give credit where credit is due, because as those of us in the room who are scholars know, we always stand on the shoulders of others. So the title, In the Room, is very much a tribute to a really path-breaking book by a political scientist named Jo Freeman. And she studied a generation of women who came after the achievement of suffrage, but before the feminist movements or movements of the 60s really sort of opened doors of opportunity for women. It's sort of a bridge generation whose accomplishment, and it's an important accomplishment, and I think we need to acknowledge it, is to get in the room and then to get their voices heard and hopefully respected and listened to by the overwhelming number of men who are in the room. So getting in the room. I am not making the claim here in the biography that Geri Joseph was necessarily the decision maker or the most important person, but she is in the room, she is respected, admired, and listened to, and that is an accomplishment that's going to create opportunities for subsequent generations of women. And of course, I talk about sort of female activism. Belle Moskowitz was New York Governor Al Smith's campaign manager in the 1920s and ran his campaign for president in 1928. She was incredibly important, but of course she couldn't be out in front and center because of who she was. And so she had a great deal of influence behind the scenes. And again, I think that reflects Geri Joseph's influence and importance. It's behind the scenes. So Geri Makiski was her name, born in 1923 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents in St. Paul, Sam and Edith. For reasons that will become clear to you later, I want to mention Geri's oldest child, her beloved daughter Shelley, was born in 1947, and then that little girl over there, that is Shelley's daughter, Jen. Jen is the one who sort of brought me into this project because it's a small world. She is the sister-in-law of a very good friend of mine from graduate school. So that's how these projects come about. If you're wondering, like, how did he ever do this? Although I should point out, part of the reason, I grew up in Minnesota, so a lot of this history I connect to, and part of my pleasure in doing this project is it's been an opportunity for me to learn a lot more about Minnesota than I knew growing up there. It's a pretty remarkable state. Geri grew up in a family that was struggling working class. Her father, Sam, worked in the auto parts business, never particularly successful, never actually owned an apartment or home, rented his entire life, including that unit on the lower right. This is a 4-unit apartment building on Milton Avenue in St. Paul. It's still there, although it's not occupied at the moment. It's in what is today actually the heart of the Jewish community in St. Paul. Personal story, it's only a few blocks from Mount Zion Synagogue, which is where I was bar mitzvahed in 1977. Of course, I had no idea about this history, but as soon as I saw it, I'm like, oh my goodness, it's just down the street here. Geri grows up in the Twin Cities in the 1920s and 30s. In the 1920s and 30s, forget what you may have heard about Minnesota being this wonderful, liberal, tolerant society. In fact, the Twin Cities, and especially Minneapolis, very segregated and very anti-Semitic. Minneapolis may, in fact, have been, if not the one of the most anti-Semitic cities in the country, for complicated reasons that I will spare you today. I will give you one fascinating fact. If you were Jewish and you were living in Minneapolis in the 1930s, you could not join AAA, the Motorist Association. I'm really not sure why that's I mean, I kind of get some anti-Semitic restrictions, but why you can't join AAA to get your tire changed or whatever other motors, I don't really understand. But I also share this with you because Geri Joseph is eventually part of an incredible transformation for the Minnesota Jewish community, which between the 1930s and the 1970s really moves from the margins of Minnesota society to really being very central and very important. And that's one area in which she is incredibly important, but I'll talk more about that later. Oops. So from day one, Geri is bright, determined, ambitious. She knows that she wants to go to college. She knows that she will have to live at home and commute to the University of Minnesota because her family doesn't have resources for her to live on campus. But she is a success in the classroom. She studies political science and journalism. She is also a fiercely independent young woman. So midway through her experience at the University of Minnesota, she decides, for reasons that I am still exploring, to go and spend a year in Monroe, Louisiana, which is about an hour from Baton Rouge. We are, in rural Louisiana. She is going to write for the local newspaper, the Monroe News-Star, and she's going to live with a Jewish family in Monroe. This is another interesting story, but you can see up there, that's the Synagogue B'nai Israel in Monroe, Louisiana. This is at a time when there were still Jewish communities in a lot of small southern cities and towns before all the kids left to go to college and didn't come back, and that's a story. So she's there. She comes back in 1944 and meets two very important and influential men in her life. The first is David Hoffner from Butte, Montana, who is a fellow student at the University of Minnesota. According to the family, and let me mention for a moment, Geri died at the age of 100 in 2023. Her younger sister, Rossi, who is now 94, living independently, playing tennis, driving, force of nature. I've interviewed her multiple times, so this is an incredible sort of, said that David Hoffner was a great guy, everybody loved him, and he was the first boy that Geri brought home that her father liked. So I guess, let's get married, you know. And except he is in the US Army Air Force at the time. So they get married while he is on a leave. He then goes back and joins the Bloody 100th, which is a famous US Army Air Force unit stationed in England. They're the masters of the air who are flying out of England over Germany and suffering horrific casualties. But he survives, he's a navigator. The other man that Geri Joseph meets in 1944 is a young political science instructor at Macalester College named Hubert Humphrey. Now, Humphrey had run for mayor of Minneapolis in 1943 and lost. In 1944, he goes over to the University of Minnesota, he goes into the Minnesota Daily newsroom, and he meets Geri Joseph. She is the paper editor, one of, if not the first female editors of the student newspaper at the University of Minnesota. Humphrey is there to get support, talk up his plans for Minneapolis. He's doing the sort of political rounds at this point. And they hit it off, they become lifelong friends. He is a mentor and supporter for Geri Joseph. You know, it's, the subtitle of the biography to come is The Age of Hubert Humphrey. Their rise is inextricably linked, these two people coming together. And part of it, and again, I'll sort of, is in Minnesota politics in the 40s, the Democrats are a minority party, the Republicans are powerful. The Republicans also control access to most of the wealthy and the corporations in Minnesota. So Humphrey and the Jewish community in Minnesota form this tight alliance, partly out of principle. They share a commitment to various causes, also out of necessity. Each needs the other to achieve their aims together. Very, very briefly, because our time is limited, I do want to sort of give you a little bit of background about Humphrey. First of all, 1944, Humphrey oversees the merger of the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. And that's why to this day in Minnesota, it's the DFL party, not the Democratic Party. 1945, Humphrey successfully runs for mayor, second time. Geri Joseph is speech writing for him at that point, okay? And she is actively involved in that particular campaign. Humphrey immediately creates a human rights commission and has Minneapolis enact a couple of anti-discrimination laws. These bring Humphrey national attention because of his commitment to what the national political world sees as civil rights. Here's the inside story from Minneapolis. Minneapolis already had laws on the books about racial discrimination. Minneapolis did not have laws on the books about religious discrimination, anti-Semitism. So what Humphrey's act really does, the Human Rights Commission and the anti-discrimination laws, is finally open doors for the Jewish community in Minneapolis. That's not part of the national story. 1948, Humphrey goes to the Democratic National Convention and gives a very famous speech in which he says to the delegates, it's time for the Democratic Party to leave what he calls the dark shade of states' rights and move into the bright sunshine of civil rights. By the way, I put this up there. This is a great book by Sam Friedman. If you're interested in the early years of Humphrey and his rise, I highly recommend this book. Very good. It's Humphrey's speech, by the way, that leads to the walkout from the Democratic Convention of Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats, and this is a clear sign that the National Democratic Party is going to be breaking up over this civil rights issue. If not in 1948, then certainly by the 1960s and 70s and 80s. So it's sort of foreshadowing as far as that is concerned. And then, of course, in 1948, Humphrey gets elected to the US Senate. But now, let's bring our story back to Geri. because Geri is also on the rise. She graduates from the University of Minnesota in 1945. She is, I'm going to keep saying this, determined, ambitious. She has her heart set on writing for the New York Times. She never got the memo, apparently, that the New York Times in 1945 was not hiring Jewish women from Minnesota. That just wasn't really part of their plan. So, Geri accepts an offer from a rising newspaper in the Twin Cities, the Minneapolis Morning Tribune. By the way, can you hear me? I'm talking quickly and Side note, she takes the job on one condition. And this is who she is, by the way. Let's be clear. It's 1945. She is 22 years old, straight out of college, and she won't take an offer from the newspaper unless they promise her that she will never have to cover fashion shows or garden parties or write for the women's page. She's like, I'm a serious journalist. I want to do investigative journalism. So if that's not what you want me to do, I'm not going to take this job. I don't know if she had a plan B, okay? But she got what she wanted, which is not the first time. Now, another digression, a little bit of background. In 1946, a year after Geri joins this, Life magazine publishes an expose of the horrible conditions in state mental institutions in Pennsylvania. The article and the photographs that accompany the article shock and horrify Americans for two reasons. First, after World War II, Americans become aware many, many soldiers have come back with what we today would call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, I mean, it wasn't. So the other thing is that these photographs that you can see here are really disturbingly reminiscent of what's coming out of the death camps in Germany and Poland and elsewhere. And the idea that we might have institutions here in the United States that treat their patients or inmates in a similar fashion, as I say, it upsets many, many people. And this sort of sets up a wave of investigation into these state health institutions across the country. In 1948, Geri Joseph writes an 11-part award-winning series about the state mental hospitals in Minnesota. She visits all 7. By the way, the governor tries to shut her down, and she says, nope, this is public matter important. She actually defies the governor to write these articles. And Minnesota Bedlam. Obviously, picking up on that Life magazine title, Minnesota Bedlam. In 1950, she goes back and sort of does a follow-up series about what is going on. And this sort of launches a lifelong interest in mental health issues, reform. This is going to be one of the themes that sort of flows through her life consistently. Here's a sample of Geri Joseph's writing, because she's an extraordinary writer, and I do feel privileged to write a biography about someone who leaves so much wonderful written material. But here's her description of, room after room filled with patients in straitjackets, shackled with leather cuffs, shrieks and moans, stench of urine and sweat. She compares it to medieval dungeons. The sense of isolation, of being cut off from home and community, in a permanent dead end. And of course, she talks about the fact that state mental hospitals were filled with elderly patients at that time. They were sort of the dumping ground for the elderly in many cases at this point. So 2 years later, in 1952, Geri is in another room. This time it's a courtroom. She's getting a divorce from David Hoffner. Many interesting stories I could tell. It was probably a first romance, wartime marriage. Many of those didn't last. Interestingly, in the divorce proceedings, the grounds for divorce, and Geri had to fear a judge, were that David slept too much and took too long to read the newspaper in the morning. I find this very amusing, that as a reporter, she should object to the fact that her husband wants to read every article in the morning paper. But again, talking to Geri's, by the way, I spoke to Geri's younger sister, Rossi, Her younger brother, RV, age 98, also alert. He's like, well, David was a great guy and we loved him. Maybe not the sharpest stick in the bunch, and maybe not quite ambitious, driven enough for her. But a year later, Geri remarries. This time she marries a man from one of the wealthiest Jewish families in Minneapolis. Burton Joseph's father, I.S. Joseph, who was a Romanian Jewish immigrant who had come to the country, sets up a grain feed business. And again, I could go off and tell you all about the grain business in Minnesota and how anti-Semitic it was and how determined they were to keep Jewish traders out, but that somehow this guy found a way in. It's an amazing side. So Burton, Joseph, and Geri, but Geri has now sort of married into a wealthy, powerful Minneapolis Jewish family. Oh, one other side fact though. Burton Joseph, believe it or not, was the starting goalie on 2 national championship teams for the University of Minnesota. I know you're shocked. You didn't even know that Jewish people played hockey, let alone would be the starting goalie on national championship teams at the University of Minnesota. So, like I said, I don't know how I keep the biography under 1,000 pages if I'm going to go off and talk about Burton and his sort of life. Geri and Burton moved to Cedar Lane, moved to a beautiful house on Cedar Lane, which is a historic street in Minneapolis. I actually visited the house. The people who bought it from them still live there, so they could tell me stories and show me around. It's a lovely place. Geri has 2 boys relatively quickly, but, and I know on Mother's Day this might not be like, well, I think that Geri Joseph liked motherhood, but it wasn't completely fulfilling and satisfying. She clearly had energies that she wanted to pursue in other ways. The idea of being a stay-at-home mother was just not something, and of course now that she's married Burton, she does have the resources, and it's important to acknowledge she can outsource a lot of the child care to others and pursue these things. And that, I think, is an important part of the story that needs to be acknowledged. So, 1956, and in case you're wondering the dates, she's actually pregnant with her second son when she decides to co-chair the Stevenson for President campaign in Minnesota. And if you look in that photograph, there's Geri in the corner, there's Hubert, Humphrey, and that's the man sort of looking down, follically challenged. That's Adlai Stevenson there in sort of the middle. 2 years later, okay, this is all happening. She is elected DFL state chairwoman, okay, 2 years later. And this becomes her springboard into the inner circle of political advisors around Humphrey. And it's very important to understand. This photograph, I mean, it is a staged photo. I don't want to tell you otherwise. But I think, based on my research, it accurately captures this relationship in the sense that Humphrey liked her, but listened to her and followed her advice. I also want to illustrate this photograph. Geri Joseph is almost always in the room as the only woman in the room. Okay, and that's part of her getting into the room as a woman is an accomplishment, being listened to in a room full of ego-driven men who are convinced that they know best whatever the subject is. This is an accomplishment. But she is now part of Humphrey's circle. She is also very close to Humphrey's wife, Muriel. And she accompanies Muriel on all sorts of campaign trips because Muriel hated campaigning and hated giving speeches. And Geri was very good at it and liked it, so she would sort of be there to support. Also, small side note, Muriel had a bit of a temper. And sometimes Geri actually had to come. So again, if I had more time, the West Virginia primary in 1960 was a bitterly contested primary. Humphrey's running for president, so is John Kennedy. Long story short, the Kennedy money and muscle and some, I don't know, dirty tricks or slightly dirty, I don't know, whatever, it's politics, it's not. Anyway, Kennedy wins the primary, which is critical for his political success. Humphrey loses, which ends his campaign. Election night, the Humphrey people are having a gathering at their hotel in Morgantown. Bobby Kennedy comes over to talk to Humphrey and to sort of make peace and say, hey, we all need to come together, we're Democrats, the goal is... And Muriel hated Bobby Kennedy. She wasn't alone. Many people did not like Bobby Kennedy. I know that David Steigerwald is writing a book about Bobby Kennedy, and many people love Bobby Kennedy from '68. But before that, he had a real reputation as a bare-knuckle, take-no-prisoners political operative. Muriel Humphrey almost attacks Bobby Kennedy at this thing. She probably would have tried to claw his eyes out if Geri Joseph hadn't pulled her back and so. Now, at the 1960 Democratic Convention, Geri Joseph is a delegate, and she is also profiled in Life magazine. She is the subject of countless profiles and biographies, and it's really profiles, I should say, in journalistic. There's the article. I highlighted a couple of sentences from there. I'm in politics, says Geri Joseph, because it is a way of getting things done, good things. Geri Joseph believes, like Humphrey, in the politics of purpose. You go into politics because you have a vision, you have goals, programs that you want to do. It's not about yourself. The other thing I highlighted there, as long as you keep your perspective and know that half the time you're going to get beaten, you're all right. Politics is a very cruel business. One of the questions that I'm grappling with and wrestling with here is, why does Geri Joseph never run for office herself? She would have been a natural. A lot of people assume she would. She's been mentioning it. I don't really have a good answer for it, except that I'm not sure she was prepared to go through the kind of abuse that she saw Humphrey and other politicians taking. She may have also believed that as a divorced Jewish woman, there might be extra abuse sent her way. She may have enjoyed being influential behind the scenes rather than being out front. But the fact is, she considers it and suggests it, but she never runs for office herself. So I just share that. For the next 12 years, Geri Joseph is not only part of Humphrey's inner circle, but through Humphrey, she becomes part of the Democratic National Committee. She is now in literally the smoke-filled back room of the Democratic Party, involved in many of the deals, many of the negotiations that are taking place. So for example, in 1964, at the Democratic Convention, she and the Minnesota Attorney General Walter Mondale are right in the middle of a dispute that involves whether or not the Democratic Party is going to seat 2 African-American delegates from Mississippi. Now, the Mississippi Democratic Party had excluded African Americans entirely from the whole political process in '64, which is why you got this Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which held their own vote, their own convention. They selected delegates. The question is, are we going to add them to the all-white Mississippi delegation or not? Long story short, Mondale and Geri Joseph are part of a backroom deal that leads to Hubert Humphrey being chosen as Lyndon Johnson's vice president, okay? Johnson had sort of made this a test for Humphrey. Can you deliver for me? Can you resolve this problem? I need this thing taken care of. Humphrey, in turn, turns to Geri Joseph and Walter Mondale and says, we got to come up with a deal. Again, I could talk, do we unseat the white delegates? Do we add African-American delegates? How do we work it out? You don't need the details. The bottom line is this works. In case you're wondering about this article, Geri Joseph is actually the woman, it's not Lady Bird, who accompanies Lyndon Johnson to the podium when he accepts the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1964. They literally drag her out of a bathtub at the hotel and say, we need you to accompany the president. Here's Geri Joseph, charming Lyndon Johnson, who liked her, Lyndon Johnson liked attractive women. Geri Joseph was an attractive woman. I think, by the way, it's clear, Lyndon Johnson liked Geri Joseph far more than he liked Hubert Humphrey. Their relationship was notoriously difficult and uncomfortable. I think, frankly, Geri Joseph, probably to the extent she could, helped Humphrey negotiate what it was like to work with Lyndon Johnson or under Lyndon Johnson. Geri Joseph is also in the middle of the great political battles of 1968. Now, I'm sure, as many of you know, in 1968, another Minnesota politician, and yes, you're probably wondering, how does a tiny little northern state with like 4 million people keep getting in the middle of national politics? Well, that's just where Minnesota was in the 1960s. Eugene McCarthy, Minnesota senator, decides he's going to challenge Lyndon Johnson. Mainly, McCarthy is opposed to the war in Vietnam, and he wants to pressure Lyndon Johnson to stop supporting and prosecuting the war in Vietnam. Now, that's the public reason. The private reason, which I've learned in my research, is that Eugene McCarthy remained really upset and bitter that Lyndon Johnson hadn't chosen him as vice president in 1964. He really thought he should have been vice president, and McCarthy has a very complicated relationship with Humphrey, who's like the overbearing big brother of Minnesota politics. Like, he's the head of the party, and McCarthy kind of resents him for this. So there's this whole personal dynamic going on, and Geri is in the middle of this because she's known Eugene McCarthy from the beginning. In fact, Geri Joseph, as a reporter, wrote the very first profile of Eugene McCarthy that was published in a newspaper in Minnesota, and she captured him to a T, which tells me that she's a really keen judge of character, and she sizes him up exactly for who he is, which is this odd person in politics. I'll just leave it at that. So now, I just want to show you a brief clip because you need to hear and see Geri Joseph. I don't want you to leave here today without actually having seen her. So here's a short video clip. She's talking about, this is from 1968, hey, all these young people are supporting McCarthy. Isn't this a problem for, Humphrey and for the Democrats, these young people? What's going to happen? So here's the...
that Senator McCarthy has a group of active, vocal young people. But I saw a survey not long ago that was made of colleges across the country that would indicate that those many quiet students, many more, support the vice president.
Why aren't more young people actively campaigning for the vice president?
Well, I think that really depends on the individual. Some people take more to political activity than others. I think the same thing is true in general society. You don't find the average person involved in politics. Unfortunately, I wish they were.
So 2 quick comments about that video clip for you. First of all, Geri Joseph is already talking about this phenomenon of the sort of the silent majority versus the vocal minority, before, Richard Nixon is sort of using that language. The other thing, you have to be from Minnesota. She's got a Minnesota accent. If you listen carefully, you can hear, which I find sort of fascinating, but it's like, oh my goodness, she sounds like everybody in Minnesota who grew up in that state. All right, let's... All right, well, so this is, obviously, I won't go into the history. As you probably know, the Democratic Convention in 1968 was chaos. Inside the convention hall and outside in the streets, where you have pitched battles between anti-war demonstrators and the Chicago police. During the 1968 campaign, Geri Joseph is chairing Women for Humphrey. She is in the war room, she's in the strategy sessions. I was privileged enough to find they actually kept minutes of meetings of Humphrey's top political strategists who met every week. And so, again, it's Geri Joseph in a room the only woman, surrounded by all of these top, tough political operatives like Larry O'Brien and all these guys, and she's holding her own. More than all, she's expressing ideas, criticizing others, back and forth. It's clear she is not, and I think this is important, she is not window dressing, she is not ornamental, she is not there simply because she and Humphrey have a friendship. It's because, given her journalism background and her experience in politics, her seat on the Democratic National Committee, she has power of her own, and she's part of it. Evidence, 1 year later, she's elected vice chair of the Democratic National Committee, okay? And this comes after Humphrey's defeat. And again, I point this out, she has developed a power base of her own. It's not completely dependent on Humphrey being the vice president or the obvious political nominee, presidential nominee moving forward. Geri Joseph is, and this is an opportunity for me to talk just briefly about this. She is a committed feminist. She is definitely a more moderate or liberal feminist, not a radical feminist. But one of her pet causes is getting more women to run for office. And of course, this is interesting. She wants other women to run for office, but she won't do it herself. And that's fair. She's thinking about whatever. But she is very committed to getting more women into the political pipeline, running for office. And as vice chair, she has, again, a position, a very important position, as the Democratic Party considers reforming how it's going to choose its delegates. And again, this is a long and complicated story, which I'll try to keep brief and simple. After 1968, the Democrats create a commission, the McGovern-Fraser Commission. Side note, Don Fraser is a congressman from Minnesota. He is Geri Joseph's congressman. So this is yet another personal and political connection that she has to this end of the smoke-filled room. A majority of the delegates will now be chosen as a result of direct primaries. And those delegates need to reflect who is voting in the primaries. There need to be, and this is important, the Democratic Party is now committed to having a fixed percentage of women, minorities, young people. Now, what this in practice means is that after 1972, the Democratic Party is going to increasingly not be a party of working people and labor unions, which is what it had been since the 1930s with Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. It's now going to become a party of the groups that I've mentioned who are mostly middle-class, college-educated, urban professionals. In other words, this is the moment where the Democratic Party begins to morph into the party we see it today. She is present at the creation of the new Democratic Party, for better or for worse. I say this is an issue that political scientists like, so we can discuss whether this is a good or bad move for the Democrats, but it's part of the transformation of the Democratic Party. She goes back into the newsroom in 1972, this time as a columnist, not as a reporter. She is now free to write columns expressing her views, personal and political views, and she jumps into it. And by the way, her columns, Mary McGorry, there were other people in this, some, remember these prominent women columnists. Geri Joseph is equally good, if not better, reading her columns. I mean, the quality of her ideas and the quality of her writing, it's really, as I say, it's a privilege to write about somebody who writes so well, because you can just quote their words. She remains very invested in mental health issues and mental health reform. I underlined a couple of things. She really is a staunch believer in some of these new medications that seem to hold out the promise that you can actually cure the mentally ill and enable them to lead normal lives. She's also very invested in removing people from these large, impersonal state mental hospitals and bringing them into community mental health centers. And you sort of saw that. She's part of a movement, and this is another part of the biography. This is a national movement believing that it will be best for everyone if this is what we achieve. Geri Joseph draws on her experience as president of the National Association for Mental Health. So again, she is right in the center of these debates about let's remove people from these institutions, let's create these community mental health centers, and all of this reform movement that's going on. She's also writing about a whole range of feminist issues. I mentioned already women as candidates, but here you can see just a partial list of the other issues that she is involved. She is an activist in all kinds of ways. And you see the last category, women in business? She's also moved into the boardroom. So when I say in the room, back room, newsroom, smoke-filled room, but also into the boardroom. And I love this photograph because, again, it captures the theme I highlighted earlier. She is the only woman in the room, okay, over and over again. And so there you go. That's Hormel is a meat packing company in Minnesota. Some of you may know about that. By the 1970s, Burton and Geri are a power couple, both nationally and in Minneapolis. I love this photograph, though, because it highlights an important dynamic in their relationship. And I've heard this from a number of people I've interviewed. They are a power couple who rarely appear together. They have their own issues, their own agendas, which they pursue. They're and so this picture kind of captures the nature of their relationship. And as a biographer, I will tell you, this is going to be a challenge for me to sort of address this in a accurate, yet, I don't know, sympathetic, non-exploitative manner. Burton, by the way, is a major, major player in Jewish philanthropies and political issues around the country. For example, he serves as president of the Anti-Defamation League in the 1970s. He is also very active in trying to fight the Arab boycott, which was requiring US companies to either fire or not hire Jewish employees, okay, as the cost of doing business with Arab countries. And so he was very involved in that issue, among many others. Now, this leads me to return to the Jewish theme for a moment, because although Geri and Burton stay in Minneapolis, the Jewish community by the 50s and 60s has, thanks to changes in the laws, managed to move out into the suburbs and establish community. The most famous Jewish suburb in the Twin Cities is St. Louis, or as it's known, St. Jewish Park, in Minneapolis. And this is a remarkable community. It's a whole separate issue, but I'm guessing, well, who's up on that screen there? You recognize any of those people? Okay. Tom Friedman of the New York Times, comedian, former Senator Al Franken, and of course that's the Coen brothers down there, and I could have put other people. It's just, the success of the Jewish community in the Twin Cities. And this is, by the way, reflective of a national trend, so I don't want to suggest it's only in Minnesota, but this is a really important post-war American story of what is happening, and they're part of it. Now, in 1978, I like to say, it's the worst of times, and it's the best of times for Geri Joseph. First of all, in 1978, her friend, her mentor, her patron, Hubert Humphrey, dies of bladder cancer. And this, I'll just give you a brief clip here. Now let's see if I can get to where I want to go quickly. It might be too hard for me to do. Let's see. There we go.
What came through in the service today?
Senator, thank you very much. Tom Pettit is in Minneapolis talking to some friends of Senator Humphrey there. Tom?
Thank you, David. 3 people in Minnesota who will miss Hubert, as everyone here still calls him. Dr. Walter Heller, professor of economics at the University of Minnesota. Geri Joseph, contributing editor of the Minneapolis Tribune and an old political ally. Dr. Arthur Naftalin, who was involved in Mayor Humphrey's running of the city government of the city of Minneapolis, then mayor yourself, Art, and now on the faculty of the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Political Science at the University of Minnesota.
Right.
What legacy does Hubert leave you?
Well, it's the legacy everybody's been talking about, Tom. It's the...
There we go.
Country. Everywhere. You'd get off the plane and people would come up to you and say, "How is my friend Hubert?" Everyone felt that he was their friend. But if I can, Tom, just for 1 second, I'd like to say something about their relationship, Hubert and Muriel's, because it was, I think, unusual. A political marriage is very difficult. I think we all know that. There are all kinds of demands, not only on the politician, but on his family. She was marvelous. I can't imagine a more perfect person to be married to Hubert Humphrey. I asked her once on a long trip out west. It was in 1964, and we were in Hawaii and California and Alaska and heaven, I don't even remember where. And I asked her once if this wasn't enormously wearing, and she didn't like to get up to speak, and yet she was doing this every day, all day. And she said, "Well, Jerry," said, "you know, you have to remember, he isn't just my husband, he's my candidate."
And then when they...
I mentioned it was a hard time. Geri Joseph in 1978 also gets the greatest opportunity of her life, which is thanks to her association with Mondale, which goes back to 1964. Mondale is now vice president under Jimmy Carter. Mondale arranges for Geri Joseph to become U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. And so now, she's in a different room in the Chancery. This is the one moment in her career, though, where she is the decision maker. She is in charge. And by all accounts, she does an extraordinary job as ambassador during a very difficult time. And again, I could argue, there was, the Iranian Revolution, there was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, there was an anti-nuclear movement, there was a lot going on in Europe at that moment, and she's in the middle of it. And because of her connection to the White House and to Mondale, she is very, very important, even beyond just being ambassador to the Netherlands, because obviously the Netherlands is not a hugely vital country in NATO terms. She's also involved in Middle Eastern politics through friendships and connections that she and Burton have as well. And so, I could talk about Camp David, and I could talk about the Israel-Egyptian peace accord. And again, she's got a role there as well. I think in some ways, my sense is this is the most rewarding part of her career. I will tell you, and it's also not clear, she might be the second female Jewish ambassador in U.S. history. This is a bit tricky because the State Department doesn't keep religious records of ambassadors, so trying to figure out what people's religious orientation is not always clear, but she's among the very first female Jewish ambassadors. She comes back to Minnesota and goes to work. She's on the board at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. By the 1980s, Geri is back in Minnesota. She's active in Minnesota politics and issues. She is also sort of the bearer of the torch, the keeper of the flame for Hubert Humphrey. And she is, very dedicated to making sure that Humphrey is remembered and revered and that his place in Minnesota history remains what it was. So she's very active in that. And then, and I apologize for the next and final part of my presentation, because this is a difficult subject to talk about, particularly on Mother's Day. So in 2003, a woman who had mental health challenges, shall we say, walked into the Hennepin County Government Center carrying a weapon. There were no metal detectors in 2003 at the Hennepin County Government Center. In case you're wondering, yes, this is 18 months after 9/11, and yet Hennepin County, the biggest urban county in Minnesota, has no metal detectors at their government center. She walks in, she goes up to the 17th floor, she walks into a waiting area, sees an attorney that she is angry with, shoots the attorney, point blank in the neck twice. He survives, miraculously. She then walks down the hall into the women's room, bursts into a stall, and shoots a woman 4 times in the head, killing her. The victim was Geri Joseph, Geri Joseph's daughter, her oldest child. It's an unbelievable blow. Geri Joseph was 80 at the time. By all accounts from family members and friends, she never really recovers. And I don't know who could. An extra layer to this tragedy is that Geri and Shelley had a difficult relationship when Shelley was younger, and I think part of it was because Geri was away frequently, pursuing her causes and her career and her activities, and there was some resentment. But when Geri came back to Minnesota in the 80s, the two of them sort of restored and rebuilt that relationship. And so Geri Joseph often said, I lost my best friend. And she lost someone. Shelley's murderer was a cousin, a mentally ill relative, okay? It was a family issue and dispute, and Shelley had sort of volunteered to intervene to try to help because this mentally ill individual and her siblings were at loggerheads, and the elderly parents had dementia, and there were state issues. It's all very messy and complicated, unfortunately. It's very familiar. But yeah, this was the blow from which she doesn't. Geri Joseph, and here she is with Shelley's daughter, Jen. I mentioned to her before, and the two of them had a very close relationship. Geri spends the next and final sort of 20 years of her life battling, well, the difficulties of old age and all of those challenges, health challenges come, but also this becomes her final crusade. She is determined to do what she can in Shelley's memory so this doesn't happen again. So she begins, for example, by pushing Hennepin County to install metal detectors, okay? And she begins a long battle to get the state to impose some different laws. Now, the cousin had purchased this weapon at a flea market, and in Minnesota at the time, there was no requirement for a background check. There was no waiting period. You just walked in, put your $60 on the table, and walked out with a weapon. So Geri Joseph spends 20 years using her connections, lobbying the state legislature, doing everything she can to try to get the law passed. In May of 2023, Governor Tim Walz, who we know from the most recent campaign, finally signed into law a public safety bill to close some of these loopholes. It took 20 years. Minnesota has a lot of hunters. There's gun issues. It's a lot going on. Geri Joseph, her health was not good. She could not attend the signing ceremony, but she was cognitively aware that she had finally won this battle, this fight, that the law had finally been signed. Another one of her granddaughters, Rachel Joseph, was present at the signing ceremony. She was holding up a picture of her aunt, Shelley, at the signing ceremony. And basically the law closes that gun show, flea market, loophole, etc. It also set up a provision allowing family or law enforcement to petition a judge to take guns away from someone determined to be mentally unstable. And again, I won't go to, everyone knew that this cousin, Susan, was mentally unstable. She made death threats. She left dead animals on Shelley's porch. but the police routinely said it doesn't rise to the level necessary for us to take action. We can't do anything. There was no red flag law in place, and so nothing could be done. Geri Joseph died in October of 2023. She was able to celebrate her 100th birthday. They had a party for her, and she enjoyed seeing her family and friends. She knew the law, was going to go into effect in July, and she lived to see that, and then she passed away in October of 2023. Now, I want to end my presentation by going back to this picture I showed you earlier. And I want you to look at it for a moment and sort of try to imagine what might be going through her head at that moment. Because I want to sort of stress to you, there is a cost, a price to be paid for fighting to get into that room. And one thing I should mention is that, Geri Joseph developed an ulcer. She had serious digestive problems, and she never smoked or drank. So it's reasonable to conclude, I think, that stress, like just the difficulty of being in these rooms in these situations. And I want to go back to the title In the Room Where It Happened, because it's also a reference to a great song from the Hamilton, the musical, which in the room where it happens. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens. Well, Geri Joseph was in that room. I gotta be in the room where it happens. I wanna be in the room where it happens. And that really is sort of her philosophy and her mindset. But she does pay a price for it. Her health, I mentioned before, maybe her relations with Shelley, there were definitely consequences. And yet, I think in the end, she felt a great sense of accomplishment and satisfaction, and she opens the door to that room for other women and subsequent generations. And so I think it's very important, because we do tend, I think, as historians, and here I will end, we tend to celebrate the generation of women who achieved suffrage, and we also celebrate the generation of women who come after the 1960s out of those feminist movements in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but maybe we don't pay sufficient attention and give sufficient consideration to that bridge generation in between, of which Geri Joseph was a part. So thank you very much for listening. I appreciate the opportunity to do this. By the way, it is 4 o'clock. I want people to feel free to leave and get on to whatever they want. I'm happy to answer questions if it's okay, Whitney, if anybody wants.
Yeah, we can have a Q&A. Because we're recording it, I'll ask you to speak in the microphone if you have a question.
Yeah, Susan.
Very, very wonderful project. And I love the way you organized it by room. What we never saw was her with other women, working with a group of women or a close friend. She was with the politicians' wives. And I wondered, did she belong to any feminist organizations? What were her relationships with the women who weren't in the room?
So it's a great question that you ask, Susan. And I'm going to answer it in two ways. First of all, once she returns to Minnesota in the 70s and 80s, she becomes active in any number of women's organizations and causes. There's the Minnesota Women's Caucus. There's a lot of organizations. So she is very, very active. And even during the campaigns, she's working with other women. I mean, let's be clear, she's often running the women's committee for, there is this segregation, this gender segregation. And that's where she's encountering other women who aren't in the smoke-filled room. I will tell you, it's also interesting though, until she comes back to Minnesota, she has relatively few women friends. And that's also part of the price she pays through her activism and involvement. So yes, she's knocking down these doors and getting into this male-filled room, but that's also part of the trade-off. But yes, she is very active in women's organizations and with women. You
Really fascinating. Thank you, Michael. Picking up on the women's issues, you noted in her long list of subjects that she addressed as a journalist, among them abortion rights.
Yeah.
Did she make notable, or what were her particular views that she expressed in that realm? Any notion there?
So again, it's abortion rights. So she is strongly pro-choice. At the same time, she recognizes that in Minnesota, the abortion issue hurts the Democrats very, very much. And I could mention, so another reason why 1978 is so important is that's the year we talk about the Minnesota Massacre, when the Republicans capture both Senate seats and the government. And the two issues that really divide and hurt the Democrats are abortion rights and gun rights. And those are like the two rails of Minnesota politics. That's where the sort of Minnesota liberalism runs off the tracks or runs aground on those two issues. But she is always strongly committed to, abortion rights and pro-choice. Yeah, sure.
When you said that she got the ambassador job,
yeah.
Who else were forerunners with her? What other famous?
Well, I mean, I've seen lists. There were other possible candidates that were being considered.
But no names that you could pop out, because I can't think of any.
There were no other famous names being considered for that position. One of the interesting things I did find out is that she's not the first female ambassador to the Netherlands. And this is also interesting because the State Department would like to have female ambassadors, but there are many countries that aren't comfortable with female ambassadors. And this is particularly true, of course, in the 1970s at that point. So Scandinavian countries were one place where you would send female ambassadors because they were more tolerant and accepting of that. So that's also, although it is interesting to note that she wasn't initially greeted with open arms by the Dutch. They changed their tone. Yes, Alexandra. It's a great question. The answer is no. They were under no pressure to include. Now, I think you have to be honest and say her association with Hubert Humphrey certainly opens doors. There's no question about that. But what's important is that she seizes on that opportunity and demonstrates that she has real important ideas and a voice and views, and then springboards from there. But no, there's no representation. When she initially makes her way in, there's no obligation for that. I mean, I should be clear. The Democratic Party is already insisting that some members of the Democratic National Committee be women and delegates need to be women, but there isn't any kind of formal quota system established at that point. Yeah.
Does she have any proteges?
See, now that's also a great question. That doesn't appear to be the case. And that's an issue that I'm still trying to work out in my own mind. Like, why isn't she mentoring or choosing? Why hasn't she taken a particular young woman or young women sort of under her wing and pushing them forward? And I'm not sure what the answer is to that yet. I just don't have a good answer for you at this stage of the project. Yeah. She's not paid. And almost like the journalism, of course, she's paid. And that's a great question. I don't know if the Minneapolis Tribune had separate salary scales for male and female reporters. I'll have to look into that and see. Susan is nodding her head, so certainly. But by the way, I didn't share this thing. So here's a little side note. I mentioned she writes this 11-part award-winning series on Minnesota Bedlam. She is given a major journalism prize, which they then try to take away when they discover that Geri is not a man, but it's short for Geraldine, Geri. She refuses to give it back, and the Minneapolis Tribune backs her up and says, nope, she's our reporter, she wrote these articles, she deserves the prize. So she kept it. But yes, that is the situation in 1950. They're like, we can't give a prize to a woman reporter. You know, we thought she was a guy, Jerry. We didn't know it was Geraldine. So there you go. That's another. And I could tell more stories. I think it's important, I've heard, simply because of her prominence and her affluence, she is not shielded or sheltered from the kind of discrimination that women faced. An example, 1972, as an accredited journalist, she goes to the Metropolitan Club in DC for a press conference involving Edmund Muskie, the Maine senator who's trying to run. And she's denied entry because the club has a rule, women can't enter the club before 5 p.m. and they have to come through the back door and they have to be accompanied. That, exactly. So, and by the way, the Tribune, again, to their credit, says, wait a minute, this isn't a private club function, this is a public press conference that a US senator is holding to talk about his campaign for president, and she's an accredited journalist who we're sending there to cover this story, and they wouldn't let her in. So, I mean, there's other examples like that. She is not completely sheltered from that kind of discrimination. So, well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you coming. Yes.
I did the tour of New York.
Oh.
And I saw late anti-Semitism all together, whatever. And my Minnesota,